Good morning and welcome everyone to today's Reform Think Tank webinar. I am absolutely thrilled to have two fantastic guests. I probably do always slightly say this when it comes to reform events, that we have fantastic guests and that they're incredibly well placed to discuss the topic we have. But I genuinely do mean it this time, as we have the Right Honourable Baroness Nicky Morgan and Sir Michael Barber, who need obviously no introduction, but clearly have both got a wealth of knowledge and understanding of actually how government works, having worked in the heart of government in number 10 for Sir Michael and obviously for Nicky as a cabinet minister, so we'll have grappled with many of the challenges that we will discuss. Now, as anyone who has joined a Zoom webinar before will know, it can take just a couple of minutes to pull everybody through so that everybody is actually with us and watching us. So we have decided that we will always do a quick quick and dirty poll to get a sense of people's views, our audience's views when we kick off. As you all know, our topic today is reimagining the state. Clearly, lots of good things have come out of the pandemic that we should be building on and strengths that we should be recognising. But also, and as any government should do, we should recognise that there have been some challenges which are perhaps due to some deficiencies in the way that government operates, and therefore we should be thinking about how we can tackle those and make sure that we are better placed in the future if we have to deal with something of a kind of similar scale and challenge. So I have a poll. I am just going to launch it. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see the poll. So what I would like, please, for all our attendees, I think panelists can also cast a vote if you would like to. But I would like to know if you think about those challenges and opportunities that COVID has revealed about the state, please choose only two, so one or two is fine, of these particular priorities you think government should be focusing on. So we've got data and digital transformation, we have devolution, we have citizen engagement, and I guess you could think of that as sort of citizen engagement and kind of maybe community capacity building, that kind of stuff. Civil service reform, increased investment in public services, and increased national self-sufficiency. And by that we mean obviously some of the challenges that we've seen have been around the fact that we've been quite dependent on global supply chains, for example, and perhaps in future we might want to look at whether we could do more things within the UK. So I will just give a few seconds for people to vote. I can see the lines literally kind of, overtaking each other and going backwards and forwards as people do cast their votes. We've had 80% of people voted at the moment. So I'll just literally give it a few more seconds for you to say which, up to two. So probably most people are thinking, well, I kind of think there's, we should do a bit of all of these things. And you would be absolutely right, in my opinion. But just for now, we're picking up to two. Okay. So we're almost at 90% voted. Of course, not everybody has to vote. Not everybody will vote. So I am going to close the poll now. There we go. And I'm just going to share the results it's actually quite interesting. I expected, I have to confess, that more people would be picking devolution, for example, but not a particularly popular one. We will, I hope, discuss it nonetheless. But interesting that increased investment in public services is obviously the most popular one, perhaps not too surprising, but also that data and digital transformation is the second most popular. So there we go. I'm going to just stop sharing those results. I guess just a little interesting exercise to kick us off and get people thinking about the sorts of topics that we might want to cover today. As I said at the start, though some people, because it does take a while to come through, may have missed it, I am delighted to have two incredibly expert guests with me in Nicky Morgan and Michael Barber. The way this event today is going to run is it will be an in-conversation style. So I will have the pleasure of being able to ask my own questions that I'm very interested in for the first sort of 15 to 20 minutes. But then I will put to our guests attendees questions. So again, I'm sure you're all very familiar, as we seem to spend 90% of our lives now on Zoom, but just in case you haven't done this before, if you hover your cursor at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see that there's various different icons. One of them says Q&A. If you click on that, a little box will come up and you will be able to pop in your question for our guests, speakers. We also have a chat function. Please, if you have anything that you want to tell us but is not a question, please do use the chat function. We will be monitoring the Q&A so that I can pose the questions to Nikki and Michael. We won't be live monitoring the chat, but you might, for example, have a great initiative you want to tell us about, or just a thought or a comment that you want to share, and we will absolutely be looking at that after the event. And obviously, if you have any great examples of stuff that's gone particularly well, we might even follow up with you, as we do love to hear the sort of success stories and kind of best practice there's a think tank we can also shine a light on. If you can keep your questions, last logistical point, if you can keep your questions nice and short, I would be forever grateful, because one of the challenges of being an online chair that you don't have when you're physically in a room is you have to read the questions at the same time as chairing. So if you see me looking to the side, it's because I will have questions coming up there, but also please do keep them short and succinct, because it's much more likely that I will be able to then actually process it and ask Michael and Nikki, and hopefully you'll get a great response back. So that's all of the logistics. So to properly kick off, our subject today is reimagining the state. There's all sorts of speculation about what the kind of, quotes, new normal might look like as we emerge from what still feels like, pretty much still the crisis phase, to be honest. I think what we have seen is, as I said at the start, some real positives. So, for example, the fact that the Treasury and HMRC could stand up an entire support scheme to protect jobs and livelihoods and businesses at the pace they did is quite phenomenal, and they deserve incredible praise for the speed with which they did that. We at Reform would say they could tweak it a little bit, but that is always what us policy wonks would say. But in principle, a fantastic example of government stepping up, responding, and actually managing, at least to this point, avoid the sort of mass unemployment that other countries that haven't responded in the same way have seen. Being able to create the Nightingale hospitals in the space of around a week, incredible response. So again, probably raises some questions around the timing, the kind of whether it was quite the right investment, but nonetheless, having that capacity now, if we do get a second peak, will be absolutely essential. So some real positives, but also some challenges. And I think the testing regime has been a good example of that. And actually, just in that one example, shows us sort of several issues from delayed decision making, perhaps, also an over centralized response originally, not thinking about trying to use different labs across the country, but trying to concentrate it. Challenges around logistics, as we know that certainly in the early stages, many of the health professionals couldn't get to a test centre within a sort of couple of hours of them, which was meaning that they were self-isolating rather than going and getting testing and being able to know. And of course, some of the more ideological challenges around engaging with the private sector. And we saw a bit of a reluctance on the part of parts of the NHS to bring the private sector in immediately to make sure that we had that additional capacity. So some of those issues I think we've seen in many other examples, not just the testing, but I think that's a good sort of single example to show multiple issues that we might want to think about. And then of course, just finally, before obviously we get to actually the point of this conversation, which is not listening to me, but is getting the insight and wisdom of Nikki and Michael. But I think what we've seen, and I'm reluctant slightly to use the B word, but I'm going to anyway, is that a bit like Brexit didn't create, but exposed the fact that many communities were feeling ignored and left behind. Actually, the pandemic hasn't created, but it has exposed some of the tensions that perhaps we've been remiss with hindsight, and hindsight is a great thing, at talking about. And they're tensions, for example, like freedom versus security, like efficiency in public services versus resilience in public services, and things like, as we had on that poll, national self-sufficiency versus global integration. And there probably isn't an exact right answer of where on the spectrum of each of those we should be sitting, but there are certainly conversations that we should be having to try and understand. So that's the kind of context for the discussion. I'm going to now actually start the meat of the event, which is to start grilling in a very friendly way our guests about what their views are on some of those topics. But I just want to kick off with I suppose a general opening question both to Nikki and Michael, which is from your perspectives and your experiences, you can picture what it will have been like in government right now, because you've both worked in the heart of government and can imagine the processes and the challenges and opportunities that they've gone through. If I can start with Nikki and then come to Michael, what would be your kind of top lines in terms of what we've seen that have been strengths of the way the government machine has been able to respond, and what do you think are the sort of 1, 2, 3 biggest challenges that we would need to try and rectify going forward?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Gosh, that's just a small question, isn't it? Really, I mean, we could probably spend a whole day on that, and there'll be a whole university and probably civil service training manuals and modules on that for years to come. I mean, I think, so a couple of points. Firstly, I think you're absolutely right to say that hindsight is a wonderful thing. And I think we really have to be very careful with all of this. And I think the coverage sometimes hasn't been quite right on this, which is judging what happened 12 weeks ago by what we know now. And I don't know if Michael feels the same, but I really feel for my colleagues, both, or my former colleagues, I suppose, both ministers and officials who have been at the heart of this. I think anybody who's been through, I mean, it's been a shock for the whole country, but anybody who's been through something like this, a major political event, it could be a conflict, it could be, some other sort of critical national event. It is career defining, but it is also, I mean, don't forget, these are people at the heart of this, and some of them have been ill, and many of them will have been worrying about family and friends and everything else. So, and I think sometimes we kind of overlook that. And I've had a few people who have really been very critical, and I have to remind people that sometimes, people won't make the best decisions, and not that anybody goes into this wanting to make bad decisions. So having put that to one side, I think what works, well, I mean, you're absolutely right to pick out the HMRC, the furlough scheme. I think that's been remarkable. I think the fact that, for example, the virus has not whipped through our prisons in the way that might have been expected. And I think that actually universal credit standing up to 1.5 million extra claims, and I think has been, as a former constituency MP, if you said that to me a couple of years ago, I would have expected that to have been a real focus for concern. And I think actually what we're going to see is our job centres, having been so good at helping people far removed from the workplace to get back into work over the last few years, those skills will be very necessary probably to help people we sadly expect to lose jobs once the furlough scheme starts to be unwound. I mean, in terms of, you're absolutely right. I think I hesitate to point to another think tank, but I'm going to just to say that Policy Exchange actually published a report recently about military planning and the role of the armed forces who are brought in to help the NHS in terms of the supply chain of PPE and other things across Whitehall. And clearly that whole issue of planning and delivery is something I think that Whitehall is going to have to look at. And I say Whitehall, I mean, I think you're going to talk about devolution, and I think that's devolution to other national governments, but also to local government. And I think just generally, I think how the state actually doesn't just think about policy direction, but actually really delivers on it, and what ministers need to do and senior officials in order to drag the state towards that is going to be something that will need to be thought about and trained for, I think. And I think what the civil service does do very well is when there is, when it's clear that there is a major event happening or about to happen, as we saw actually with the no deal planning for Brexit, actually, what happens is that the whole machinery does pivot towards delivering on that, but it takes some time. And of course, with the virus, time is not one of the things we had. And I'm sure we'll come into it. I, having been there for the start in January and into February, I've not been a health minister, so I don't know what the conversations were, but I think the seriousness of the situation took some time to reach the top levels of government and top levels of departments before people really realised that actually they're going to have to ditch everything else they were doing and focus on this. So I think the sort of the emotional shock, if you like, on all sides as well, of realising that actually you just have to abandon everything else and focus, shouldn't be underestimated. In a way, I mean, the extraordinary thing about being a minister, and I said this the other day, is that there are no job interviews. You had a number of people who are new after a reshuffle, and you're there not because of how you're going to respond to a pandemic. You're there potentially because your face fits. The Prime Minister needs someone like you to be in that job at that time. They thought that actually you'd be delivering X policy and suddenly it's Y policy. So, it's not like it is not a normal working environment in any way. And I think that's the difference between the military analogy and Whitehall as well, is it's very different from being the armed forces, where the chain of command is very clear. I'll leave it there, but I'm sure we're going to unpick all those things.
Loads and loads to unpick. Thank you so much. And actually nicely teed up anyway, I think, for Michael as the kind of master of delivery and understanding how you do take the ideas and the kind of the sort of ambitions and the goals and turn it into something that happens on the ground. So Michael, can I pose the same question to you, kind of the things that have gone well and the things that we really do need to reflect on?
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you. And it's a pleasure to work with you, Charlie, and Nikki, of course. I thought Nikki gave a very, very good summary of some of the successes, which HMRC Treasury, for example, I think have had what you'd call a good crisis. They've done really well. And I agree with the other observations Nikki made. The one set of institutions I'd add is universities. Some of the universities, first of all, on research. Secondly, if you go to the University of West England, Bristol, they put together a Nightingale Hospital in no time. Same at Exeter, same in many other places. And although it was a challenge, they did get digital teaching and learning going. Of course, they can improve at that, and hopefully they will. So I think they've done well through the crisis. But I think just going back to Nikki's early points, having been in number 10 for 4 years through, for example, 9/11 and all the consequences of that, I remember that sense of crisis. And two things that I remember feeling. One is, surprising to people outside, you're glad you're there because this really matters. And secondly, there's a sense of solidarity in the team. And I think it's just a very practical thing for the current crisis management is that a lot of the people, they're not all there in a team, they're all on Zoom. And I think that I remember the Monday morning briefing in number 10, the sense of solidarity as you went through those things. And there are people in number 10 doing important work, but you haven't got quite the same sense of human interaction when it's all on Zoom. So I think that just adds to the challenge that we have to manage. I like Nikki, I think I've been very keen not to just judge things, people using hindsight. You asked about reimagining. I mean, the theme is reimagining state. And I think that there's questions about that need to, how do we learn the lessons of this in a systematic way? I think too often when there's a crisis, inquiries are all about who's to blame, and the media obviously think along those lines most of the time. But actually, the really critical question is, what can we learn from this, and how can we apply that in? And I think there will be some key lessons there. I've been interested to see Australia respond very well, for example, on the COVID-19 crisis. And I think that's in part because they'd just been through the bushfire crisis, which actually hadn't gone very well for the Prime Minister, but they learnt some lessons and they applied them in. So that's credit to them. And you can spend time in politics finding people to blame, but I would much rather focus it on learning the lessons and how do you want to reform the state to make it more capable in the future.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, there is a huge amount actually in both of your comments, and I think it is an important point to sort of say, these are humans, and actually not just the it's very interesting, Michael, not just the fact that so many people are working from home, and that will be the same in departments as well, of course, and so that is just whatever the great advantages of virtual working, there are also downsides to that. But also the fact, as Nikki, you pointed out, it wasn't just the PM who obviously very, very serious dose of the virus, but actually there was at one point quite a few people in number 10 who had it. So, you know, it's not a, if you can ever have a normal crisis, it's not a normal situation to be having to respond to it. And so I think that is quite important for us to remember. Just to dig down then into a couple of sort of more specific, I guess, elements. I wonder if I could start with Michael, you just asking around risk, because of course this is one of those scenarios where we're getting real-time information in terms of the science, which, as Nikki, you pointed out, we're learning new things almost on a daily basis. So, you know, what we would do today is clearly not necessarily what we did 12 weeks ago. But there's also some interesting questions, I think, to unpick around what is the role of the scientists and the medics advising government, and what is the role of the politicians who have to actually take decisions. And if we're seeing now quite a high level of fear amongst the population, and perhaps not necessarily a brilliant understanding of the risk to us as individuals, because we know that actually the risk is very, very low for a lot of us, though clearly not everyone. Michael, how should government think about risk, and are the lessons that we should be learning around some of the decisions that have been taken that have ended us here 12 weeks later, as opposed to perhaps closer to where some other countries are in terms of easing the lockdown and that kind of stuff?
Well, it's an important question. I think there are several aspects of it. One is, what can we learn from what's already happened to managing the COVID-19 crisis as it goes into its next phases, which, because we're by no means through it, and both the economic and the health implications for the next year or two. So one set of learning. And the second is for crisis management in general. I mean, we might, you know, there's a climate change threat on the horizon. That's going to have some consequences. There are always risks that that should be, we should be ready to manage. And I think one of the things that, you know, you talk about reimagining the state will have to invest more than it would have done in the past, I think, in resilience and in security in an uncertain world. I don't just mean armed forces security, I mean security in a general sense. And that's going to be challenging because there's going to be a lot of pressure on the public finances. So the political leadership then needs to be saying, we're doing this for these reasons. And it's about stewardship. It's about looking after the country. It's about looking after the planet. And preparing for risks is an investment in stewardship, leaving things better than we found them. And I think that will be there needs to be a political language to set that out. And I don't think it needs to be party political, although the current climate, who knows? So that's one thing. The other thing that I think is important in this is the capacity of the state to learn as it goes. I mean, people sometimes have said in media commentary they're making it up as they go along, and in a way, that's the right thing to do. As you get more information, you adjust. So that's important. And I think that leads to your fundamental question about the science and the politicians. In any of these big decisions, you should, of course, take the science, the data, the evidence into account. You should assemble it. But then two things apply. One is you never have a complete picture. Secondly, the science, the evidence, the data doesn't necessarily always tell a single story. Often there's conflicting stories. And thirdly, it's the job of the politicians to make decisions. They have to judge and make that. Dave Brailsford, the wonderful leader of British Cycling and then of Team Sky and now of Team Ineos, has this very nice line where he says, the data informs, it doesn't decide. And the politicians have to decide, and they take decisions with incomplete information, and some of those will work and some of them won't work. And so when you've made a decision, monitoring its implementation is important, because the worst thing, which is why I'm so passionate about delivery, is when you make statements about this is what we're going to do and then it doesn't happen. So you've got to build your delivery architecture to make sure that the decisions, once you've taken them, actually get done. And if your delivery architecture is good, you'll be learning as you implement, and you can adjust if it's not quite right.
And just building on that, Nikki, are the lessons for politicians who are in leadership positions, and all politicians are, but I suppose on a kind of national stage, it's interesting having seen different styles internationally of the way that kind of prime ministers and cabinet members or equivalents have responded. And one of the observations I've heard several times is that actually where other nations' leaders have been perhaps a bit more open about kind of some of the challenges, perhaps that maybe mistakes will have been made, some of the trade-offs that you're having to decide on in live time. Yeah. Do you think that, and I suppose that, you know, by implication, that our leadership hasn't been as willing to date, at least, to sort of be that open and transparent with the public, and perhaps being a bit more trusting that the public will get that in these circumstances, as Michael's describing, kind of you can't have all the answers at this point. Do you think there are lessons there, and how difficult is that, given the media and the pressures, for politicians to be a bit more willing to expose kind of their own fallibility?
Well, I think that is a really important question. And I have to say, I think overall the coverage of this crisis has been pretty mixed by the media. I think that the scientific editors on the broadcasters and the newspapers actually have done a very good job of trying to explain the facts. And it goes back to your original question, which is about measuring risk. And the point is that so I suspect at the start, obviously we'll come back to the science in a moment, but you know, when the Prime Minister made his broadcast on 23rd, the instruction he had and the speechwriter had was get everybody to stay indoors. And in a way, that was a very simple message. You know, I mean, his line, I don't think anyone who sat there and listened to it live, you must stay indoors, will forget being in that, you know, listening to it. Any other message is going to have to be more nuanced, and as we came out of lockdown, and about measuring risk. Now, I was listening to the other day to some broadcast interviews with members of the public about going shopping when non-essential retail opened on Monday. And actually, it was completely fascinating. Now, they chose, obviously, I don't know they chose, but they broadcast articulate people. But actually, listening to them and how they'd calculated leaving their homes, going shopping, everything else, showed that people were taking responsibility for deciding on risk for themselves and their families. But they do need information. And that's where I think the media played a role, absolutely, in terms of giving people enough facts to be able to decide. But unfortunately, I think also these situations, what I've learned from politics is nothing is ever black and white. It's all shades of grey. And trying to communicate that nuance and get it through to the public is very hard. I think the public do understand about that, because they understand they live their lives as shades of grey as well. But there's a wall sometimes. And somebody said to me recently, why is saying sorry so difficult for politicians? You know, I'm sorry we got this wrong. And the truth is, because in normal life, if you say sorry, that usually means that chapter is over and you move on. Unfortunately, what happens in terms of our coverage is you say sorry, and that just gives it another day's coverage or another 3 days coverage, because everybody then wants to unpick, well, why did that mistake happen, everything else. I think the public understand in a fast-moving pandemic, in an unprecedented way, there are going to be things that are not going to go right. I think sometimes actually Matt Hancock and others have been very good about laying out, you know, the balance between, you know, continuing social distancing versus reopening the economy. So I think that there are those who are more confident. And I agree with you that actually it's, again, goes back to being confident about giving those Downing Street press briefings, which are very high octane experiences, both for the ministers doing them and for the scientific advisors, because one wrong word is suddenly on the front page of a newspaper, stopping proper discussion of what is going on. So I think in terms of the other thing I was just thinking, as I was listening to Michael talking, I mean, ministerial experience. So we don't have any virologists or immunologists sitting around a cabinet table. And there's a bigger debate to be had about, do we need more scientists in politics? I'm sure the answer is absolutely yes. But they're not there at the moment. And Michael's completely right that politicians are there to decide. And what I found being a minister was I would get great advice, and I would say, this looks fabulous on a piece of paper in Whitehall. It's never going to wash in the market of Loughborough, which I got mocked for. But, you know, my marketplace in Loughborough is a very important testing ground of public opinion. So I think, you know, translating exactly the scientific advice you get, the fact it's never going to be complete, into decisions, understanding the psychology of people. That is the role of politicians. The last two things I'd just say is, firstly, I think we don't have, again, unlike probably other bits of, say, the NHS or other bits of the state, we don't have collective memories of ministers because they're often not there for very long. And so you are reliant on people who are longer serving officials or longer serving advisors, because they have got more of a collective memory. In a way, that's what when we talk about reimagining the state, we need to think about how do we collect the learnings of ministers and people who have made those difficult decisions. And the Institute for Government does a great role now in collecting anecdotes from serving ministers or those who just left government. And the other thing I think is, we're still in politics, very short-termism. It's all done in 5-year horizons between elections. And so thinking long-term, I think that long-term thinking has to be something that's more likely to be done by officials. But when a minister goes in, probably the first thing they ought to say is, what is this department's contribution to the National Risk Register, and where are we on preparing for those things? I'm afraid it was very tempting, certainly, to leave the National Risk Register to people like Oliver Letwin in the Cabinet Office, and for us to get on with the more exciting policy development in other departments.
And that's a really interesting point. And we've actually got a question that has come through about, which, several people have been sort of reflecting on the fact that we obviously had the simulation exercise back in 2016 for a pandemic. And, there's lots of discussions we had around the type of pandemic, whether it's influenza or if it's, a coronavirus-based one. But nonetheless, clearly, the right thing was done in doing a simulation. Weaknesses in the response in the simulation were identified. There was at least some form of a plan of what you might need to do to fill in those gaps. And yet the general view is that not that much was actually kind of acted on and put in place. And I wonder, maybe I can come, Michael, to you first, and then Nikki, to get your reflections. But, how far is it possible, and I guess this comes back to that point around resilience and efficiency, because if you take PPE, how far is it possible to stockpile masses of something, spend an awful lot of money on that, and then have to justify that to the Public Accounts Committee or to the NEO or whatever, for a scenario that may or may not happen, whilst you've got someone else saying, but we need more money in education, we need more money in social care, and you're saying, well, no, I'm going to do these things because it will make us more resilient, whereas everybody else is saying, well, hold on a minute, that doesn't seem like the best investment. And that ties together so many different kind of questions around conversations you have with the public and what have you. But Michael, is there a way of, when those exercises are done, really making sure that the actions are taken as a response? And how do you have those conversations which prioritize resilience over the more kind of efficiency type narrative that we've had for a long time now?
Well, I think and there's a general underlying point, which is if we want to build an ever more capable state, which is implied in the title of the session, then that has to go across parliaments through changes of leadership, certainly changes of minister, and needs to be a thread. And so that does need, as Nikki was saying earlier, to be embedded in the way the civil service thinks. And there are people who do that. But it also needs a dialogue with the public, because that's how you can make the justification for prioritising resilience and stewardship ahead of immediate spending on the NHS or education or whatever it might be. And that needs to be explained. And there will never be a better time than as we come out of this crisis to have that conversation with the public. And I think that should be a very high priority. I'd just like to draw attention to a province or state that's doing very well, New South Wales in Australia. So Australia's actually had a good crisis, but New South Wales had a really good run. The Premier there, it's a Liberal administration, which in Australia it means Conservative. And the Premier is called Gladys Berejiklian, and she's very, very thoughtful, determined, focused person, and she's got her delivery priorities. And I mention this because I've had some interaction with this government, and they've done a couple of things that I think every state should be thinking about. As they manage the crisis, they haven't completely lost sight of their pre-existing priorities. So they had, for example, they had a priority to reduce homelessness. They've actually accelerated that. they had a priority to reduce the numbers of suicides. They've kept working away at that. So one thing in crisis management is not just to manage the crisis, but to cling on to your pre-existing priorities, because they're going to come back. And if you've totally lost momentum, it will be very difficult to get them back. The second thing is you need to plan for the future. There will be a future, and it won't be the same as the past. I've been very struck by Britain in 1940. One of Nicky's predecessors in the Department of Education, which was called the Board of Education, in 1940, when Britain was at risk of being invaded, had no allies, Blitz was starting. The permanent secretary of the Board of Education tasked about 6 civil servants to go and book into a hotel in Bournemouth, away from the Blitz. Said, don't worry about the evacuation, we'll manage that. Can you just plan the post-war education system?
Yeah.
Even though they might well have lost in 1940, there they were in Bournemouth planning. And the plan they did became the Green Paper of 1941 and the White Paper of 1943 and the 1944 Education Act. But right now, somebody somewhere in each government department, in my view, should be planning the future away from the pressures of the crisis. Only a small number of people, but clever, thoughtful people who can then get a little bit of the Secretary of State's time or the Prime Minister's time, maybe an hour a week at most, maybe an hour, a couple of hours a month. So, because they're going to be incredibly busy, but you haven't lost sight of the future. And I think that's something that would really pay dividends in the long run.
And that is a massive issue on the health side as well, where we've seen, and someone commented to me yesterday that we've now got a national COVID service, not a national health service, in terms of the stuff that isn't happening, both on mental health and physical health. And, you know, there's going to be a very, very long shadow of, unfortunately, very poor health outcomes for people because we weren't in a position to do those two things at the same time. Nikki, I wonder if I can put to you a couple of intertwining a couple of the questions that we've had, which I think links to this conversation that we're currently, or the topic we're currently focused on, which is a couple of people saying, so the point about the simulation exercise in 2016 and sort of what was the responsibility of the senior civil servants to keep pushing the need to act, given, as you say, we have changes in administrations, in politicians, etc. The continuity, and we can have a conversation, perhaps not for today, about continuity within senior civil servants as well, which is not brilliant, but kind of what's the responsibility there? And someone else has pointed out that actually, you know, the scientists didn't get everything right. And actually, if you look at the minutes from SAGE, for example, they weren't pushing for the lockdown immediately, which kind of some people have applied was the politicians' reluctance, but actually the advice. So I guess the question is sort of how far do we have a strong enough civil service / advisor capacity that sits below those ministers who have to take the decisions, but who are willing to keep pushing and slightly kind of, you know, it's the age-old speak truth to power, but really keep hammering at the things that actually have to happen because of something that might occur in the distance, when understandably ministers are thinking, I've got this thing right in front of me at the moment I need to deal with.
I'm sure we do have that capacity. The question is whether the system encourages them to keep saying, don't forget about this. And you're right, it's very off-putting, I imagine, if the minister keeps on saying, but hang on a second, I want to announce this and I want to do this and everything else. I mean, so when you arrive in a department, I have to say the quality, to my two departments, the quality of the handover was quite different. I think it depends on whether the department expects a new Secretary of State on the day of the reshuffle or not. And I think it also depends on the experience levels of the Secretary of State as to, do you know which questions to ask? Now, did anybody say to me, and I've seen a couple of things coming up about the simulation exercise, did anybody say to me in DCMS, we did this exercise and you should know that one of the things on the National Risk Register is that in the event of a viral pandemic, we would have to lock down the economy, and that would have devastating impacts for large venues, music, cultural, this, you know, obviously not. Was it a question I would have thought to have asked? No, because I think a viral pandemic involving a total lockdown of the economy was outside all of our expectations. But as Michael says, the fact is now that it has happened, it has opened up some areas for discussion, and I think never again will we have to persuade the public that actually we do need to invest in this. The difficulty, of course, is that, and Michael's right to say, we will be living with this crisis for a number of years, at least, depending on vaccines and everything else. But no crisis ever repeats itself. So, you know, there'll always be something else. So you need to have somebody, your team of 6 or whatever, who are constantly thinking, what's going on around the world? What's happening here? What could the next problem be? And I think that if raised with sufficient urgency or sufficient seriousness by the Permanent Secretary, you know, you will listen as a Secretary of State. You have to. I mean, that's your job. But I also think, so 2 things I think would come out of this. One is, Michael mentioned homelessness. I mean, again, another remarkable success has been that over 5,000 people who were on the streets were taken off the streets in a matter of days. Now, I know that, but talking to somebody locally who's been involved in that, the access they've had to those people in terms of then helping them to think about different ways of living is extraordinary. You know, that's a sort of priority that absolutely must be continued, and I hope that MHCLG are doing that. So, you know, there are a few things, and the other thing actually is the use of, there's always been a political debate about the use of the private sector in the NHS. But surely to goodness now, as we get back on our feet, we must accept the private sector could help with elective surgery, cancer treatment, mental health counselling, all those sorts of things. And again, I think if what we see in Westminster is a debate going back to private versus public, I just don't think that's where the public, the members of the public are. And so that's where I think understanding, you know, what has changed as a result of this crisis is so important.
I really want to reinforce that last point on the public and private. I mean, it's not about, there's no question of privatisation of the NHS, but making good use of private capacity has to be part of the answer, as indeed has been part of the NHS for at least 15, 20 years now. So I think that is really important. And the kind of ideological public versus private debate needs to be replaced by one about how do you get the job done, what's effective, has the private or the public sector got the right capacity to deliver for us in these circumstances. I totally support that. The other thing underlying Nikki's answers are a set of subjective things about whether officials feel able to tell to power, how you build relationships, how you get collaboration working at the heart of government, and a capable state will also think about what FDR called the science of human relations. How are people getting on at the heart of this? Because if you get the right relationship, it's not about not saying negative things. People have got to feel. In one of my early meetings in Pakistan, I told the chief minister of one of the provinces something really. You know, that his education system basically wasn't working. On the way out, one of the officials said to me, "You shouldn't tell people what they don't want to hear." But once that becomes embedded, you'll never solve any problem. So I think thinking about the ways ministers interact among themselves, ministers interact with senior civil servants, and civil servants interact with ministers is a fundamental part of a capable state. So my point is there's subjective elements of capability, not just objective ones.
Oh, Charlie's frozen, I think.
Thank you, and I love the idea. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, hopefully you can hear me again.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm gonna persevere and hope you can hear me. I hope that one of the things that does come out of this is that we are more outcomes focused rather than process focused. The 2 things I did want to make sure we do talk about are devolution and technology and digital, because they've been such big questions, I think, through here, and a couple of things coming in on the. I can start with the devolution point, because clearly we've talked a lot about the central government's response, but an awful lot of the response has actually been delivered by local government. And community groups. And I wonder the powers and the funding for local government, and could this, you know, I think every government has a big ambition to devolve. Could this actually be one of the triggers to see us do that? And what might that look like? I wonder whether, Nikki, I could come to you first for that.
It could be a trigger. But it's got to be, so, you know, one of the things we haven't, I think, talked about yet is a sort of turf war type thing, which happens in both Whitehall but it also happens between national and local government. And for the sake of full disclosure, I should say I'm married to a local authority leader. So I've seen some of the local government response very up close in the last few weeks. I think they've taken their responsibilities very seriously. And again, one of the things that I think that has worked are the local resilience forums, which are, I think, probably a well-kept secret from everybody, apart from those who are, you know, MPs and in government at various levels. And I think you're right about the community response as well. And local government takes very seriously their responsibility to stimulate businesses and high streets as well, which, you know, is going to be very important. I think one of the triggers for it probably is going to be the way that the future lockdowns are managed. If what we're going to see is more regional and local lockdowns, which seem to me to be the only way to go in order to avoid, you know, the continuing national economic damage, but also if we haven't touched on schools, but if we want schools to go back, but we're going to see that if there is a flare up, then, you know, there's going to be a variation and everything else. Then I think what we're going to have to do is have better data sharing, which perhaps gets on to your second point, between national and local government, and more trust. And I take the point that some of the mayors have said, and Andy Burnham, I think, and Steve Rotherham, which is that they feel they haven't had enough information in order to make decisions. And I think that is there's always going to be tension, but I really think that is an area for big discussion.
Michael, I mean, it's interesting internationally, and you obviously do a lot internationally.
Yeah.
That we are a particularly centralised nation, and perhaps some of the countries that have had a better response having, although obviously not some of the kind of further East Asian ones, but some of the countries have been more of a federal model and have managed to respond perhaps more swiftly. Yes,
I mean, I think it depends on the capability of government at each level. And I think in the general debate about devolution, it's important to get, I find too much of the debate too vague. It's important to be really precise about what you want to devolve and what, in many cases, you might want to hold centrally, because they're important. So being precise about what we're talking about is important. I've seen this in the US, like if you live in Washington DC, so the mayor, that DC has its approach to lockdown. Virginia has its approach to lockdown. Maryland has its approach to lockdown. They're all slightly different. So if you just, but if you're on the public transit system, that cuts across all those boundaries. So devolution creates some issues at that level. But the other thing we've seen in the commentary on America a lot about what the president is or isn't doing or thinks he's doing. But actually at city level and some state levels, there's been some outstanding practice in managing this. And we've been working with a number of major US cities on their COVID-19 response. And what they've done, there's an organization called the National League of Cities, and they've got a local action tracker. And anybody in the National League of Cities, which is several hundred big cities across the US, some of them quite small, can look and see what each of the others are doing, learn rapidly, and it even gives you the phone number and the name of the person that you want to, so you say, oh, I want to do what they're doing, you can call them up and find out. So I think as we devolve, and I agree with Nikki, I think we might be doing different things in different places in the next 2 or 3 years. Being able to learn horizontally as well as vertically up the devolution chain will be very, very important.
And linked to that then is, as Nikki, you were saying, and some actually of what Michael, you're alluding to, is this question around data sharing. We have seen one of the real positives actually that we haven't commented on too much yet is the pace at which innovation, or at least adoption of technologies and kind of, digitization has happened, which has been a real strength. And I hope that is something we can build on. Nikki, you will be very familiar from your period in DCMS with some of the challenges around the digital agenda. How can we make sure we can more effectively use data, and how can we make sure that we safely deliver digitization that still takes into account things like the privacy and the kind of ethical questions that that perhaps we've had less time to focus on during this period because of the crisis?
So it's really interesting. One of the books that lockdown has given me the advantage of not being in government to read has been something called the Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which is, I have to say, I think I feel like it's one of those things you deserve a prize for having read, because it's incredibly dense, but it's beautifully written, and it's all about the sort of data age that we live in. And one of my lessons from doing DCMS job is that data is the new black gold, basically. And, you know, if you are an organization that has a lot of data, you are in a very strong position in the 21st century. I think one of the things is to educate all of the rest of us about who has our data, how it's being used, and everything else. And again, people, I think, understand, particularly in relation to, so one of her arguments is that 9/11 allowed the surveillance authorities, if you like, to leap ahead, and people were understood that and basically trying to keep people physically safe. And I think now perhaps people understand that their data is used to keep them healthy in terms of the contact tracing app. But I thought it was very interesting last night, one of the emails I spotted was from Big Brother Watch, who was celebrating the fall of the government's tracing app because they were very concerned about where the data was going to be held, and they want to use the other method of having data closer to home. So, I mean, I have to say, I think this is one of the areas where DCMS is going to, working with the Cabinet Office, is going to have to take a real lead in terms of the government's approach to data generally and to tech companies. So the economic stimulus package we're expecting, one of the things will be, we are world leading in terms of software developers, data scientists and other things. That's why tech companies want to be based here. That's great for our economy, important for reskilling. But equally, how we look after people's data, what does Brexit mean in terms of being part of GDPR or not? All those are really, really relevant questions, which I think we are going to have to work out a way of involving the public in. But you know, I have implications. I mean, you're right, digitization. I think one of the other great leaps forward is going to be more and more GP appointments being done over either video conferencing or telephone. Should have happened years ago, but actually I think this will, you know, give it a big leap forward. But again, that raised all sorts of other issues. So I think we shouldn't be frightened of this. I think I saw one of the questions came up about Citizens Assembly. You know, these are the sorts of things I think we will need to involve the public in deciding, you know, what the appetite is.
I strongly agree with those comments, and I'll award myself the prize for having read that book as well. That you said, because it is a very good surveillance capitalism, and one of the problems about the data debate in Britain and around the world is that everybody's in favour of privacy and everybody's in favour of transparency, and you can't have both all of the time. It's a kind of direct contradiction. The Australian government, the federal government, passed a law during the crisis to get their contact tracing app and function going, and they explicitly put into the law that the data would be deleted immediately, etc., etc. So they reassured the lobby, the civil liberties lobby, quite rightly, that this was about improving people's health, not about gathering data. For example, the law said they wouldn't share any of that data with anybody outside of Australia. So if an intelligence agent from somewhere else wanted that data, they weren't going to do it. So that's on the face of the law. And I think I think there are ways through these things. I agree with Nikki about the importance of ubiquitous data and fast data and all of those things. I think the key to that in the future is the Treasury, actually, and the spending review coming up is a real opportunity to say, you know, if we're going to allocate money in these circumstances when countries all around the world are going into debt, we have to be clear, department by department, what data you're going to gather that will tell us whether that's being spent well, and don't come to us with a separate budget for data. Just build the data in. It's just data comes as standard. I think should be their line. And just to finish with an example, in Punjab, Pakistan, they developed when I was working there an app for vaccinating children against the basic childhood diseases, because the vaccinators before that weren't really working. But once they had a tablet, you could track them on GPS. When they vaccinated a child, they photographed the child. The photograph went immediately to a computer in Lahore. So in real time, the Department of Health in Lahore was building a picture of who's been vaccinated, who hasn't, where do we send them next week, all of that. All these things are doable. If they can do it there, there's no reason why we can't do these things here.
Absolutely.
And then as a final question, which has come in on the chat to you both, I hope you can still hear me. Clearly I'm having some internet issues. Okay. Good, okay, perfect. Which is about education, and obviously both of you are experts on education, so it would be a bit remiss of me not to kind of pose the question. And the question is around sort of Is this an example where almost too much devolution has meant that we haven't been able to respond well, because actually schools have been able to take their own decisions? Some schools are not opening at all, you know, kind of actually there is real potential damage that's going to do to children's futures. You know, but on the other hand, clearly we have said there are great advantages to autonomy amongst schools. So I suppose the first question, how do we get schools back, and should we be being more directive, and this versus control that has left us in a more difficult position now? Perhaps Nikki, I can go to you first.
Yeah, so I think my view on this, I mean, education is obviously absolutely critical. It's critical to the young person going through it who hasn't, and I think what's been striking has been the variability between what schools have been able to offer. And also, just picking up on the digitalisation, I am very concerned about the whole digital divide. Even if a school is offering online learning, we know there are families for whom it's not been possible to access it, and it's also very difficult for working parents as well, juggling everything else, leaving aside the need for better monitoring of children at risk and safeguarding and everything else. I mean, I think it is right that schools should make the decision and that governors should make the decision. Going back to where you talked at the beginning about measuring risk, it would be completely wrong, I think, for the DfE to lay down the law on that when we're asking people by and large to think about the risk for themselves as lockdown is eased. But I also think in terms of planning and involving as many different voices as possible in the education sector, you know, that's where the DfE, the Secretary of State, absolutely, you know, play a role in understanding what's going on in the front line, what are the concerns, what do we need to do to help to address all of those. And I think it's right. I mean, you know, Marcus Rashford, great credit for free school meals, but there's a lot more that needs to happen around free school meals over the summer in terms of catch up and support. And actually, in many cases, speaking as a mum of a 12-year-old, it's not actually about the learning as such. It's actually about exercise and socialization and getting out and all the rest of it. And I do think that this year, the summer holidays provide an opportunity for some of those things to be rectified as we become more confident about coming out of lockdown.
Thank you. And Michael, your thoughts?
I think we should have a kind of national expectation that by the beginning of the September or the autumn term, that kids will be back in school, and that will be expected. Obviously, there might be exceptions, but the rule should be everybody's back unless there's some clearly demonstrable need for an exception, because the children and young people are missing out on very important swathes of education. Some young people won't have had any teaching from March through to September. And that is a huge problem, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds of different ways. And we're losing the progress we made in Nikki's tenure and others in the Department of Education on narrowing the achievement gap. So that is something we should be really worried about. So I would set a national expectation for the beginning of the autumn term and really focus on getting everything in place to make that happen, working through how you do social distancing in those circumstances, what it looks like, and make sure that every parent and every school knows that is the expectation. And in the meantime, where children are not able to go to school, ensuring that the digital offer is significant. Nikki mentioned the variation. I've been struck by the brilliance that some of the schools have managed that with, and equally, I'm afraid, some of the less effective practice. I think we need to start working to develop that. And if there are going to be periods in the next year or two of digital learning, we just need to make sure there's a minimum expectation there and that parents know what that is.
Perfect, thank you. Well, we have sadly got to the end of our hour. I feel like there's another 25 questions at least that I could ask you both. I'm sure that everybody listening has found it just as stimulating and interesting and insightful as I have. Thank you so much, both Nikki and Michael, for giving up an hour this morning. I know you're both being completely inundated at the moment, so I'm incredibly grateful that you have given some time to reform. Just to kind of by way of a slight summary, the thing that struck me, I suppose, in a lot of the topics that we've discussed is actually how government communicates with the country, be that on tech and digital, be it on, you know, risk and kind of, you know, the sort of trade-offs that you have to make as decision makers, be that whether things are done at a local level or a national level. And I think perhaps that's one of the big takeaways from this pandemic, that we need a kind of much more open and citizen engaged conversation about what the state should look like in the future than perhaps we've been able to achieve to date. And maybe this is the moment for citizens' assemblies, which again is one of those things that sort of keeps coming up and down at various points, to become a reality. So thank you so much. Can I thank everybody as well who has joined us this morning, and the questions that you have put in. Hopefully I've managed to get through most of them, or at least touch them on the edges, if not the kind of specific point. Lots of great insight as well internationally. Thank you, Michael, for sharing that. I loved the point, not an international example, but I loved the point about the 6 people in Bournemouth planning the future of the education system. And I'm definitely going to steal that as an example that I use and take away. So thank you so much. Just as a final bit of logistics for people listening, we do have a couple more webinars coming up. We've got one next week on the new economic settlement. So how do we rebuild the social contract? So actually linking in with some of the stuff we talked about today. Do get in touch if you want to join us for that. And then we have justice after lockdown, which we're very excited about, and have the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, who'll be joining us for that one. So please do get in touch if you'd like to join us. We hope you've enjoyed it. Again, thank you all for listening, and a massive, massive thank you. And I'm sure if we could all be giving you a proper round of applause, Nikki and Michael, we would be doing so. So thank you so much. And everybody, enjoy your weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.